Hello, my name is Arthur Chapman. I work at University College London, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to be with you today talking about history. I've been working in school history and in teacher history education for nearly 30 years now, and this is a topic very close to my heart, and it's a pleasure to be able to share some thoughts with you about it. My title is What is School History For? So I'm really going to be talking to you about aims and about what we think we're doing in England, but also about the difficulties that we face, the problems that we have trying to achieve those aims, and the possibilities that history can hold out for us and for young people. I hope that what I say will be of some interest to you, and let's get started. Okay, so if you have a look at our national curriculum, and this is the national curriculum which is compulsory up to the age of 14 in England, you'll see the following aims as being specified by the government. All children must come to these understandings and this knowledge. The first two of these aims are about content, about the story of history, the knowledge itself. The first, it states that children must come to understand the history of our country so that they can locate themselves in time and make sense of what's happening. I think that's what's behind it. And the second one talks about Europe and the world. And both of them are about learning content. And they don't actually say explicitly why, but the clear intention, I think, is to enable young children and young people to make sense of the world around them so that they can act more effectively in it and not be astonished by what's happening and have some sense of where it's all going. You can also see there some aims to do with content, concepts. The third bullet point is to do with learning some of the concepts that they'll need to make sense of this content. So the first 1, 2, 3 bullet points then talk about content and concepts necessary to understand it. The final 3 bullet points are about the discipline of history. And this is something we do in England. We divide up our thinking of history, about history, between substantive knowledge, knowledge of content, the first 3 bullet points, and then second order or procedural knowledge relating to the discipline of history. So as well as coming to know various things about the world in order to make sense of the world, we want our students to be able to make sense of history as a discipline, as a way of knowing. And you can see in the 4th bullet point reference to historical concepts like change and cause, similarity, difference, significance. We spend a lot of time trying to build understandings of those concepts in England. Not just that though, the 5th bullet point talks about history as an epistemology, as a way of knowing. And as you can see, the expectation is that through teaching history, we help to teach children how to inquire, how to ask questions, how to work with evidence and come to answers. And you'll also see from the final bullet point, the point of all of that, which is to try and help children understand the world historically, to get a perspective on it, but also to understand how things fit together and how they can process information that they learn in order to solve problems over various scales and of various kinds, social problems, political problems. So this is really how we conceive of history. There are some aspects of these aims that would be controversial and that many people disagree with. I'm not very happy, for example, about how the first one is phrased. It asks us to think of these islands. My country is made up of at least 4 different nations, the English, the Irish, the Scottish, and the Welsh. And the country consists of more than one island. So the first bullet point, I think, is problematic because it asks us to think of this plural thing, islands plural, involving more than one nation, plural, as a singular thing. It wants us to think of one story that will unite all of those. And a lot of historians might question that. But nevertheless, I think a lot of us would agree about this general principle that we should be teaching children knowledge of their country and the world, and Europe and a wider context, because this knowledge will empower them and help them understand what's going on. But we should also be teaching them about the discipline, about the way of knowing that is history, because this will help them make sense of the past, but also make sense of the present. History teaches wisdom, if you like, about how we can know things and about the nature of processes in time. Okay, so these are the kinds of aims that are typically advocated in England. You'll find more about them and more discussion of the problems we have in trying to achieve them in this book that I've recently edited. It's published in January 2021. I mention it because of that, but also because it's free. So this is a book which you can download without any charge from my university press, University College London Press. And I just encourage you to do that if you find it interesting. I'm going to talk about some of the ideas discussed in the book. So here is an example of the sort of thing that I used to share with my students when I was a teacher. This is their course guide for their post-16 studies in history. When I worked at Isha College as a history teacher in 2002. And you can see the things I was just talking about, a focus on knowledge, understanding and applying knowledge. History as being a way of mastering and developing world knowledge, which will empower children as actors in their lives. But also a lot of things here to do with analysis, because history is a discipline of analysis, and we can't have the content without understanding how it is produced. So we need to teach both the content and the analysis. Here is another analysis of the sorts of knowledge that are involved in learning history. We need to know a lot of content about the world. We need to understand concepts such as feudalism, the Renaissance, revolution, enlightenment, these sorts of ideas. Not just that though, those are two, if you like, content-focused aims, conceptual content and factual content. We also need procedural knowledge, knowledge of the discipline, knowledge of how we reason in history, and of course, because history involves mastering information, organizing ideas, reading and writing, there are lots of general skills, aren't there, that historians need to master and that we'll be teaching in our history lessons. So you can see there, I think, the sort of things that we would typically discuss in England when we talk about history. Here is the same sort of thing in a bit more detail. On the one hand, the first order, knowledge and understanding, we'd be wanting to encourage and develop knowledge and understanding of the world of the past, of past worlds, if you like. And on the other hand, second order understanding, knowledge and understanding of the discipline of history, of how we make sense of the world. You can break those things down further. The first order knowledge consists of general concepts. In history, we rely on general literacy, don't we? General knowledge of how the world works. Concepts like inflation, like assassination, economic concepts, social concepts. We have to teach those. We want children to master those. So running history courses involves sequencing and developing general understandings of economic, social, political kinds. But it also involves facts, singular factual propositions. The date of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, for example. Not just that, point C on the first order side, historical concepts such as Archduke, such as feudalism, such as Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have to help children master those sorts of things, don't we? And then there are what are called colligations, which are big generalizations like the First World War, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. So we can see already then that there are lots of different types of knowledge we want to try and develop, and that teaching historical knowledge is not a simple thing. It involves knowledges of different kinds, and we need to think about how to teach all of those in different ways, don't we, if we're going to develop this knowledge. Not just that though, as well, as I said, there's knowledge of the discipline, knowledge of historical time, how to measure that, how to organize it, knowledge of change in time, knowledge of causation, how do things happen in history and how can we analyze them? Why was there an assassination in 1914 in Sarajevo and so on? And we work with evidence, don't we, to try and come up with these ways of understanding. So we need to help children understand that. And on the basis of all of this, we make judgments of significance in history, and we need to teach children how to make them, but also how to evaluate the judgments other people make. We also look at interpretation, don't we, which is the ways in which the past has been understood by different people at different times, And it's vital to help children understand that if they're going to make sense of the world. So I think you can agree then from what we're saying here that learning history is quite a complex matter. And if you like, one of the challenges is trying to get all of this in, to develop all these understandings and these ways of understanding and this concrete knowledge through children's education. And research tells us that not only is there the challenge of helping them come to these new understandings, there's also the challenge of what they already think. As it says in the middle here, students do not come to their classrooms empty-handed. Children come to school with lots of ideas in their minds already. And many of those ideas will actually get in the way of their learning history. So for example, under point 1, they'll have everyday ideas about how the world works, and based on their common experience in the present. And of course, the world of the past is not like the world of the present. People did things for different reasons in the Middle Ages than they do now. They had different beliefs. So one of the problems we have is children misunderstanding things because they treat the past as if it was the present. And we're all familiar with that, I think, as history teachers. Not only that, though, children have ideas about how we know things based on everyday life. You know, you can go and ask people in everyday life. You can go and watch things, can't you? But history involves something which is no longer there, which you cannot watch. You can ask people if they were there, but what happens if you want to study the Middle Ages? You know, everyday ideas about knowledge. So what this slide is doing really is saying that history is not simply, the challenge of teaching and learning history is not simply about developing knowledge, it's about replacing ideas which get in the way of historical learning. And these are ideas about the world, but also ideas about how we know. Another challenge, though, is actually building up narratives in children's minds, building up structures of knowledge that will be useful to them. And this is a very interesting diagram developed by an English teacher called Kate Hammond in 2014 in our history teacher journal, Teaching History. And what's interesting about it is that it works like in ripples, like a ripple in a pool, with different circles moving out from the middle. And in the middle of this, we've got knowledge of episodes, knowledge of particular events and episodes in the past. And that's what we teach in our lessons. We teach kind of knowledge of everyday happenings, of events, like the assassination in Sarajevo, like the Black Death. Like in the future, I suppose the COVID pandemic will be one of the topics people teach about. And we teach these topics in various ways, which is what the different segments of this diagram show you. We can look at an event in the past from a political perspective, from a social perspective, from the perspective of the history of ideas. But the point the diagram is making is we don't want to just stay at the circle in the middle. We don't want to just stay with the event itself. The point of studying events in the past is to get some sense of periods in the past and how things worked in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, during the Enlightenment. But we don't just want to learn about periods in the past. We want children to use what they've learned about the past to make sense of the world more generally. And that is what this outer circle is about. It's about developing general world knowledge as a result of having studied particular periods, as a result of having studied particular events. And this points to one of the challenges, I think, that's involved in teaching and learning history, which is sequencing things so that over time they add up and build up to not just a knowledge of an event, but to a knowledge of a period. Not just a knowledge of a period, but a knowledge of history in general that will be of use for wider discussion. Okay, what are some of the challenges with all of this then? One of them is that history tends to approach things in a very analytical way. History is a scientific discipline, but when people talk about the past, they think about the past in all sorts of ways. There's a really good book, which I recommend thoroughly, by Herman Poole, Key Issues in Historical Theory, it's called, and that's the English translation. It's a Belgian book, I believe. But Herman Poole and this philosopher Mark Day, both of them identify a range of ways of thinking about time and the past, which go beyond what we do in history. So in history, we tend to focus on analytical relations to the past, on epistemic questions about knowledge and so on. But actually, of course, people use the past for political reasons, to assert identity. people use the past to think about morality and responsibility and how people have behaved in the past and what obligations that puts on us now. People also think about the past aesthetically. They talk about love of old objects, and being in an old environment, has effects on our feelings and thinking, doesn't it? And we mustn't forget all of this. So one challenge for history education is that while we may be trying to develop analytical understandings and epistemic understandings, all these other issues also arise. History is used and abused politically. We have to equip our students with the ability to analyze and critique and evaluate the history they will come across in everyday life, much of which is politically manipulated. Not just that, though, of course. Children want to see that they can think morally often about the things we're teaching. Sometimes they get upset because what we're teaching describes tragic activities and tragic events. And we need to also be able to provide moral reflection on the meaning of all of this in our lessons. So history is challenging then because there's much more to it than just the analytical analysis of how the world works. And you can see that in many of the controversies we've had recently. Here is a Black Lives Matter episode that took place in England last summer. Here is the defense of a statue. In the Black Lives Matter, the issue was the removal of a statue because people felt it was morally offensive because it was a statue of a slave trader. And this brings out the moral relationships of the past. And we need to help our students in history understand what's going on when things like this happen. Here is from Charlottesville in 2017, an attempt to protect a statue. And these things happen in children's everyday lives, and we need to help them understand what's going on and make sense of it all, don't we, in history, not just to provide analytical approaches to things. And even analytical approaches to things contain moral and aesthetic dimensions. This is an example of a really excellent analytical book on Black history produced in Britain. But the book and the television series it's based on is also about memory, about commemorating episodes in the past where things were done which are now considered deeply shameful. And what this shows, I think, is how analytical history, the book, but also moral concerns, such as the commemoration we can see here with plaques, one of them at a slave trading station in Bunce Island, the other one commemorating Roman troops who were from North Africa. This shows how the moral and the analytical intertwine. Another challenge I think we face is the challenge of the contemporary world. We've seen in the last year, if you think about it, all sorts of things which talk to profound changes in how the world is organized. I'm referring here to the Anthropocene, for example, or to the notion of climate change. Now, I'm not suggesting that we use history to indoctrinate children into particular points of view on the present. What I'm trying to say is we are surrounded by dramatic changes in our present. For example, the fires in the Amazon in Brazil last summer, the bushfires raging across Australia, the spread of COVID-19, which many people link to deforestation and to moving into rainforests and encountering animals we hadn't encountered before. So we've got global challenges which disrupt many of the narratives around history, which history's been organized, and which ask us to think of history at a level other than the level of the nation state. So if you like, there's the challenge of the Anthropocene. This is one of the challenges that I think we have to cope with in history. There are other ones as well. There's the challenge of thinking about large scale processes across the world. And what I'm showing you here is the Bill Gates Foundation supported project, the Big History project, which takes large scale history and tries to provide resources to enable us to address it. So even though it's a challenge that we haven't typically dealt with in the past in history very well, because certainly in my country and in many others also, history's primarily been about the nation state, we can see that challenged by developments in our world, such as large-scale global problems. But there are also really helpful things, such as this curriculum produced to help us deal with that. So as well as there being a challenge, if you like, there's a solution. There are two things I would say that it seems to me need to change and develop in history education in my country, and I hope these have some resonance and some relevance for you in Hungary also. One of them is this first point. We need to go beyond conventional political history, which is what we've traditionally done. We need to consider other forms of relation to the past, moral relations to the past, aesthetic relations to the past, political ones, so that children understand the history that's happening around them in the news and in politics. If all our history lessons do is give them a story of the past or the tools with which to create historical knowledge, we haven't equipped children to understand how history is present all around them. So I'm thinking that history education needs to be adequate to what people will encounter, not just to a historical discipline. And the other thing I'd want to say is on the right-hand side here, which is what I've just been pointing to by talking about the Anthropocene. Traditionally, history has been quite narrow. It's been the history of the nation state. It's been quite small scale. It's covered modern history often rather than the whole of history. If we want children to be able to make sense of the world that they're in, we have to acknowledge that that world is global and that processes of change in it are taking place at a scale and at a speed which is unprecedented. And this is what the science tells us around global warming, but also what many people point to more broadly when they talk about the nature of the era we are in, of accelerating global crises and global change, particularly in the last 60, 70 years since the 1950s. So we need history, I think, that goes global, that works at scale. And of course, that's going to be challenging to develop with children, because the conceptual demands, the demands of knowledge building that I pointed to before, only multiply if we go large. But that's where I'm going to stop, because I'm aware I'm actually over time. I apologize for speaking for longer than I should have done. But hopefully there are some useful things there which will inspire some discussion and debate. As I've said, some of them are addressed in this book, which I mentioned earlier, and which is freely available. Hopefully there's something useful there for you. Thank you very much.